See wherever you like.
Yeah, I'm glad I didn't make reservations. I'm gonna sit up in the front.
We're going to let people join us. We're going to give everybody just a few more minutes so that we can get started at about 6:35. Come on in. Welcome, everyone. I hope you can hear me, both online and in the room. I kind of have a loud voice, so I think you can hear me in the room. My name's Mary Catherine Gibbs. Nice to meet some of you in person for the first time. This is our 13th community engagement event. All of them have been virtual so far, except for our site tours. So this is really exciting to start this in a hybrid form. We intend that our future meetings are likely going to be in a hybrid form. We're going to see how this one works out, but this is our first one. So if there are some hiccups, please pardon our dust and understand that we're going to need some, if we have one, we'll move it through. Okay. I did want to at least give out the Zoom instructions that we always have, because we have actually a number of participants on Zoom. We have 85 on Zoom. So I think people still like the virtual option. So audience members on Zoom, please note that you are muted both in your camera and in your audio. We do this to ensure that we are going to try and get through all of our material comprehensively and take questions at the end. I think that is one of our city staff. If you wouldn't mind muting our participants, that would be great. But if you hold your questions until the end, and if we need to go back, we can go back to slides, and there's going to be plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. We also are asking that if you're online, you can have two choices. You can either submit your questions in the question bar at the bottom of your screen, the Q&A, or you can raise your hand at the end of the presentations and ask your questions verbally. We'll also be taking questions online as well. Our email, if you don't have it, is hrpinfo.midatlantic@hilcoglobal.com. That's on our website. So we have actually had received questions into other meetings prior to meeting. So that email is available. We'll be collating the questions at the end, trying to answer as many of them as we can. If we can't get through them all in the time allotted, we do also put up on our website all of the questions that are asked in any presentation, and the answers to those questions are posted. In addition, you probably heard, this meeting is being recorded, and we also post a tape of the meeting on the HRP website, as well as this presentation itself. All of our past presentations are on our website, which is hrpalx.com. So with that, we intend this to be, as we have in all other community engagement events, to be a true conversation. Make sure we get you as much information as we possibly can and answer as many questions of you as we possibly can. So why don't we get started? And I'm going to turn it over to Melissa.
Thanks, Mary Catherine. It's good to see everyone here in the room tonight and so many of you online. My name is Melissa Schrock. I'm Executive Vice President of the Mixed Use Development Team at Hilco Redevelopment Partners. You can see many of our other team members on this page that are working on the project, many of whom you will hear from tonight. Next to myself up there on the screen is Juliana Connolly. She leads our environmental remediation program within Hilco for all of our sites nationwide. We've also added an SVP of mixed use construction in the back. He won't be presenting tonight, but he's here available for questions, and that's John Newhall. Nick Pollara is our internal expert on deconstruction of these kinds of facilities, and he has flown in from Chicago, joining us tonight to talk about that aspect of the project. Person I'm sure many of you know is Michelle Beeman Chang, our local lead on the project here. She's joined by Danny Petway, who's recently joined our team as a Vice President of Construction here in Alexandria, and Siobhan Steen and Rodney Dew in the back, also on the Mixed Use Development Team. Many of you may know that HRP specializes in the acquisition and remediation of these kinds of former industrial sites, and then the redevelopment of them into more productive uses. My group handles anything that we do that's urban and mixed use, so housing, office, lab, life science, retail, hotel, those sorts of things are the kinds of uses that my team works on. We also have a division that does new industrial development, so light industrial development, logistics type space. Just go to the next slide. For those of you who are active in the CDD process, which ran from about February of 2021 until July of last year, you will probably be familiar with this slide. These were 3 principles that we developed during the CDD process as it relates to the physical redevelopment of the site. So these were guiding principles for us as we started to think about how to redevelop the site. The first one, integrate the site back into the neighborhood, into the surrounding context. The thing has been a barrier, right? It's been an island unto itself for 60 years, but it's also been a barrier from the rest of Alexandria to get out into the waterfront. And so the first thing we want to do is reintegrate it into the site. The second thing is now get people down to the waterfront, connect them to the waterfront in a variety of different ways through passive and active recreational opportunities, and really expand the access that Alexandrians have to that waterfront. And the third is to provide meaningful, varied open space. So those active uses, those passive uses, you will hear from Simon Beer from OJB Landscape Architects tonight in terms of what's been planned to date for the open space and what the next steps are going to be in the community engagement as we continue to design those spaces in the next year and a half. And then another aspect of what we, I guess I would say an additional principle that we've layered in as we've continued to move through the entitlement and permitting process is to create a sustainable new place. And you will hear some about what we're doing from Linda Toth from Arup tonight. We've submitted to the city a draft coordinated sustainability strategy. We'll be submitting shortly a second draft of that, and she'll be talking about what are all the principles and the content that's in that document, the guiding principles that will guide us as we further refine the development. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Mary Catherine to just talk a little bit about our agenda.
You want to do that?
You want me to click?
Yep. So thank you all for coming here tonight. I think Melissa actually gave a really good intro as to what we are going to be talking about tonight. We're starting tonight with the abatement, deconstruction, and environmental remediation of the power plant. In addition to that, as Melissa described, we're going to be talking about the connectivity of open space and show you a roadmap as to how we're going to think through that process. Following that, Linda is going to talk to you about the coordinated sustainability strategy, which is an important document that's going to guide the development of this project. And finally, we're going to go over next steps with you as where we are in the entitlement process. In that vein, you guys have seen a schedule like this if you attended any of our other events. And on the left-hand side of it is what have we've already accomplished, where we started over there is when the CDD was approved in July of last year. And all the things that we've done since then and relate to submissions of documents, the infrastructure development site plan that talks about the roads, that talks about the utilities. The draft coordinated sustainability strategy went in. We actually put in our first concept of the first blocks of the DS, they're called development special use permits. That's when we're actually going to start designing the buildings. We're working through that. And we are now going to be having reviews of our coordinated sustainability strategy by the Environmental Policy Commission and the Planning Commission and the City Council. Those are going to happen in March. And then we'll move to, hopefully we'll get their endorsement in April. And then the infrastructure development site plan is slated to have a hearing with the Planning Commission, doesn't have to go to City Council, only goes to Planning Commission in June of this year. After that, we'll move forward through several more community meetings to talk about the development of the blocks. So you can see what buildings might be coming online in the project. And we're moving towards a late fourth quarter 2023, end of this year, for the development special use permit hearings on those blocks. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Juliana for, right, abatement? No, is it going to you, Nick? Got it.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead. No, Melissa, I'll let you drive there. Again, my name is Nick Polera, VP Development out of the Chicago office, and I oversee and work on our abatement and deconstruction projects. Just to start, this will be HRP's fifth demolition or coal-fired power plant deconstruction project. Our approach is very straightforward. We follow typical protocols here. So the current state that we're in right now, we're identifying regulated wastes or regulated materials within the power plant. We've had teams going in and out doing asbestos surveys and other materials like ballast, mercury switches, things of that nature, which leads up to the next step in the deconstruction process, which is selecting a contractor. But we need all that information first to understand what that contractor is actually going to need to do to successfully execute on the project. And then you can see here in the two photos in the bottom left is the regulated waste removal. Specifically, this is abatement work that's being done. And then the type of deconstruction we're going to do on this project, which is a top-down piece by piece dismantlement. There will be no implosions or use of explosives on this project. More than likely what you'll see is a large crane, like we can see in this upper right-hand corner of the photo, or large excavators taking apart the buildings in a piece by piece manner. Sorry, Melissa got me in the eye there with the laser. And then again, just back to HRP's experience, over 300 acres of coal-fired power plants. I've been a part of all those projects, a 1,300 acre oil refinery in Philadelphia, and then 20 plus acres of commercial buildings, and hopefully growing here as we look to the future. Next slide. So just a quick example of what we believe the decon and abatement phasing will be. We believe we're going to work from south to north on the property, with the first area being the coal yard, or that kind of open grass area, and some of the auxiliary buildings, and then working around the power plant, taking some of the other ancillary buildings down, and then what we call the precipitators, which is kind of that large structural steel metal structure on the water side of the property. And then right now, currently, the last phase will be the turbine hall and that other brick structure, which houses the furnaces or the boilers. That'll be the last piece to be deconstructed. Next slide. So based on that phasing plan, generally, this is what we see the overall kind of timeline to look like. As you can see, procurement and permitting, so the design, the planning, getting our different team members involved and on board to really understand what we need to do to execute on this project is a big portion of what we do. Abatement is always the first step in deconstruction. We need to make sure the asbestos, the regulated waste and materials are removed. Like I said, the light bulbs, the ballasts, and any other constituents that we find above grade have to be gone before we start that deconstruction. And then the last part is bringing the buildings down, which, like I said, we will not be using explosives or implosions. You'll see large equipment taking it apart piece by piece. And then I'll get into kind of our mitigants here. So there's quite a few things that we'll do from a mitigation perspective. Rodent control is step number 1, part of the permitting process in all jurisdictions. So we'll set that up about 10 days prior. Currently, we don't have any issues. We haven't seen any rodent control issues, but it's just a standard step in that process. Noise control, always a big concern of ours. We have a lot of big equipment moving around. We'll have a lot of material that's coming down, again, in controlled fashion, but we'll have a noise control program, which we'll develop with our deconstruction team as we bring them on board. Vibration monitoring prior to the work, during the work, and then obviously as we move into the next phase of construction, that'll be an ongoing program. And then an existing condition survey, obviously of the property, which we have done. I did that before we purchased it. What my team's doing right now with the regulated materials, and then into the neighboring properties and the neighboring infrastructure. We'll make sure that's all surveyed prior to us commencing the large bulk of the work. Probably the biggest and most important mitigation measure is dust mitigation during the deconstruction. There's always going to be dust localized where we're working, but what the team does, as you can see by both of the photos here, is using large amounts of water, either through hoses or what we call water bosses in this particular photo. That's really engulfing that area and being a localized like point of attack approach. And we take that on in all phases of the deconstruction, whether it's inside the buildings or outside where it's visible. Ample amount of water is our best mitigation measure. Next slide. Asbestos abatement approach. Again, this is a pretty straightforward process. It's heavily regulated as to how the teams have to move forward and remove this material. Again, currently we are in the identification phase with licensed state inspectors who we've hired, local consultants who are in there doing those surveys and developing those reports. And then once we actually get into the abatement process, we'll have a team of licensed professionals who will be monitoring as project managers, inspectors, and then actually the workers are also licensed to remove the asbestos in particular. And then one last piece there, which I can talk to, you don't have to jump back, but prior to the deconstruction, again, we have to make sure that all those regulated materials are gone. Specifically with the asbestos, we'll get a final clearance letter, which is an inspection not only by a third party, but also a requirement before we get the demo permit here with the City of Alexandria. Community communication, no different than what the team's been doing for the prior 12 or 13 community meetings, is something we'll continue to do. As we continue to bring on our consultants and deconstruction professionals, as they prepare their plans, we will be presenting those to everyone so you understand exactly what we're going to be doing. On top of that, in addition to our website that we have now for the project, we'll update that with the deconstruction and abatement information. Have a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week hotline. This is something we do on every project. The online portal, the weekly updates, so on and so forth. Again, these are all standard practices that we implement on all our abatement and deconstruction projects. Next slide. Environmental background, that is Juliana's turn.
Thanks, Nick. All right. Sure. If you don't mind, that'd be great. Hi, everyone. I'm Juliana Connolly, and I lead environmental remediation work here at this site and also for Hilco Redevelopment Partners throughout the country. And I'll can you hear me? Is that good? I have a loud voice. I'm going to do 1 minute on sort of the difference between what Nick was talking about and what I'm going to talk about. And I think there's two three ideas to think about. Abatement that Nick was talking about prior to deconstruction, we're really talking about materials that were put in the places where they are now on purpose to do a job. They had a job to do while they were there. The stuff that I am dealing with is stuff that got out of where it was supposed to be and is now in a place where it shouldn't be, and we have to go find it and clean it up. So sort of on purpose versus accidentally released to the environment. That's one important distinction. Another distinction is sort of above ground versus below ground. So we can't always see when these regulated materials get out of their containers or the intentional places where they were meant to be and into the subsurface, into the soil or the groundwater. Can't see them. And so our investigation activities, our identification activities take a little bit longer, often involve iterative steps because we're in the subgrade. But those are two things to sort of keep in mind. In this case, at this site in Virginia, we are working under two cleanup programs or two remediation programs. One is called the Voluntary Remediation Program. This is a Virginia state cleanup program. It's voluntary, so property owners can enter their site into it. And when you take your site through that whole process, you get sort of demonstration from the state that they think you've adequately looked for those things that might have gotten away from where they should have been and cleaned them up. And so there's sort of a uniform process that different properties can go through. And that really has to do with looking for contamination. So going out, you don't necessarily know that a release has occurred, that the chemicals have gone to somewhere where they shouldn't be, but you actively go and look for it. Another way that remediation can sort of be prompted is when a known release occurs, and that's the other cleanup program that we're in at this site. And this has to do with a petroleum release that occurred behind the building. There were two heating oil tanks in that sort of lime green area. And this is an incident that occurred prior to our ownership where the release was known. So you had tanks, you knew how much oil was in them. And then one day there was less oil in them than there should have been. So you know that that occurred and the prior owner did know that that occurred. And so that cleanup work started. So there, you don't need to worry about it, but just there are two regulatory programs. We will comply with regulations under both. So we did assume this responsibility for the petroleum release that was already known at the time that we acquired the property. So we took over that responsibility from the prior owner. And then the voluntary remediation program we actively entered after we acquired the property. Yes, that's a great question. Yeah, I have a slide on it later if you don't mind. And then if you have questions, I can get to them then. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to talk first about the voluntary remediation program, and then I'll talk about that oil release area. So the first thing we do, again, because we're talking about subgrade, below grade, I can't see it with my eyeballs is the thing that I say a lot. The first thing we do is do a lot of historical research. So we're looking at reports about what used to go on. We're looking at where were chemicals stored? We're looking at a lot of aerial photographs. Because if I go look at this property right now, which you can see out our window, this looks like a nice grassy field. I don't see anything going on right there. But if I look at historic aerial photographs, I can see that that area was used for coal storage for decades and decades and decades. So the first thing that we do before we go drill any holes in the ground is look at all the historical information that we get our hands on and say, hey, where were there activities that could have resulted in a chemical getting out of the place where it should have been and into the soil and groundwater? And that's what these different color-coded areas show. So these are the types of things that could have, if something didn't go as planned, resulted in an impact to the subsurface. So that light green area that I mentioned is the known petroleum release area. There are two large underground storage tanks that contained heating oil. The areas shown in blue are areas where chemical, so not coal, not oil, but other chemicals were stored that were used in the power plant operations. The orange is the building itself. Building always suspicious. Floor drains, things like that. Who knows what happened? So always curious what happened under there. Yellow, drain lines. Again, always curious because what goes down the drain then finds it a new home if it made it down the drain incorrectly. The darker green areas are the primarily coal storage areas on this site. So coal coal-fired power plants. Also produce coal ash, and at some of these plants, there would be large areas that were used for coal ash storage. So the ash that's produced on the backside of the process. In this case, given the limited real estate, there was not a lot of coal ash stored on the site. The coal ash was mostly shipped pretty quickly off the property. So it's primarily the coal storage and less so the coal ash storage on this property. That's different than some of the other coal-fired power plants that we own or former plants. Transformers and electrical equipment are these red areas. Those are always of interest, partially because they contain oils that are used to essentially keep that equipment from lighting on fire. And then for a certain period of time, those oils would have contained a group of chemicals called polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. Some of you may be familiar with those. Those were chemicals that were added to the dielectric fluid or the oil for its heat capacity properties. So essentially just to keep those wires that are transmitting large amounts of electricity out of this plant, out to where people can use it. Don't want those things lighting on fire. So that's what the PCBs were for. They were banned in the United States decades ago, but they're very pervasive in the environment. So where we see electrical transmission equipment, that's one of the primary contaminants that we're focused on. And then the last one here is the rail yard, this area here, rail yards, always again, an area of suspicion for potential releases because things were transported, things get moved. When you're moving stuff around, there's always a chance that something could spill. So this is where we start. Where do we need to go look? And then once we identify these areas, you'll see it's pretty much the whole site in this case, but where do we need to go look? Then we design a program to drill holes in the ground because I can't see it with my eyes. I can't see underground. And even if I couldn't see the chemicals. I have to go collect samples of the soil, of the groundwater. So the water that's in the ground, send those to a laboratory and run chemical analyses on them. So you'll see on the next slides, we've collected samples really across the vast majority of the site, not under the buildings yet. Yeah, great. And so these locations show where we planned to collect soil locations. Most of these have been completed, not this area in the transformer yet, just because the physical access was not possible. And you'll see not under the building yet. So those areas will come later. We just physically can't drill holes in that area right now. But so we've got locations you can see throughout the property. And then mostly we analyzed these samples for the same type of constituents. But for example, here we're focused on PCBs. Over here in the coal, we're focused on constituents that are present in the coal. The pink areas that you see are locations. Hi, sorry, go ahead.
There were trucks and people last week drilling holes in the green area. What was that for?
Those are
So-
not chemical samples. Nick will answer that
That's
question.
a great question, not to speak on behalf of my construction counterpart. But those were test pits for the geotechnical aspects of the soils for utilities, for utility identification last week. So there's a number of underground facilities here that are existing that need to remain. And they were locating those underground utilities to make sure that we can construct around them in the future. Does that make sense?
Thanks, Nick. So visual observation, but no chemical sampling as part of the work that you would have observed last week. The pink dots you'll see on here are locations that were completed as soil borings and then where a monitoring well was installed. So a monitoring well is what allows us to collect a groundwater sample that can then be sent to the laboratory for analysis. These sampling locations were documented in a work plan that was submitted to VDEQ in the fall of 2021. So we got their input on the sampling locations and the analyte lists prior to going out and doing this work. You can go to the next slide. Okay, and so this shows what we ended up doing. So the last one was the plan. This is what we actually were able to complete. You'll see the primary difference is these borings were not completed. It just physically wasn't possible. We'll come back and do it later. We just couldn't do it during that initial event. So overall, there were 49 soil samples collected from 22 locations. So what that means, 22 sort of spatial locations, and then samples from multiple depths. So depending on what the chemical is and how it may have been released to the environment, the depth where that contamination may be present in the subsurface could be different. So we sample at different depths. This lists all the chemicals that we analyze those samples for. So metals, we're interested in metals primarily because of the coal, but also potentially the presence of historic fill on this property. Petroleum hydrocarbons really associated with fuel oils and those transformer oils that may have been present on the property. PCBs I talked about on the last slide. And then two groups of chemicals referred to as SVOCs and VOCs. Those are large groups of chemicals, semi-volatile organic compounds, volatile organic compounds. We can talk the chemistry if anyone wants, but they're long lists of chemicals. They give us a very broad understanding of what may be in the ground. Sure. Uh-huh. Great question. They're not sent to the Virginia DEQ. They're sent to a laboratory, a commercial laboratory that does routinely this type of analysis. Those laboratories are certified by regulatory agencies like the VDEQ, but the VDEQ doesn't do the work itself.
Present that will give us a sense of the authenticity of this company who will do the sampling.
The sampling or the laboratory
The
analysis?
laboratory work.
Yep. Yeah. So the laboratory analysis, all of the laboratory reports come with a very significant amount of what we call quality assurance and quality control data that is included in the laboratory report. So first, the laboratory's certifications and their documentation that they are following procedures is provided, and then all of the specific quality control information related to those specific samples is provided as part of the laboratory report. All of those laboratory reports are appended to the report, that the written report that we prepared, or that our consultant prepared with these results. Does that make sense?
Do I understand that the DEQ will have hierarchy in looking at the sampling company and going over the samples?
So VDEQ will review so the way the process works is we submit a sampling plan to VDEQ. They review that plan, they give us their input. We then go do the sampling, and then we document the results in a written report. And as attachment to that written report is all the detailed laboratory analysis, and VDEQ then reviews that report. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. We've
Okay.
had problems with that kind of an issue before, so that's why I'm zoning in on it.
Sure. This is a very, very regulated process. The analytical methods, so like the actual laboratory methods that are used, are prescribed by US EPA, and they're a very formalized process. These are very highly regulated analyses that these laboratories would do over and over again. And then there are specific tests that we do to check the accuracy. So one example would be, I have a monitoring well. I want to know what the concentrations are. I want to know how much variability there might be. So I'll collect 2 samples from that well, and I send them both to the lab. The lab doesn't know they're both from the same well. And that allows me to test how good the lab is at confirming that concentration. So, this one came at 1.2 and this one's 1.3. Okay, that feels pretty good. If it comes back at 1.2 and 79, I'm like, something going on. So there's a lot of checks like that built into our analysis to make sure that the data that we have is usable for the decision-making that we need to do.
One more quick question. Is the city involved in this?
Yeah, do you want to?
Real quick?
Yeah.
That's a great question. And yes, they are. And actually the city applied for and was granted a grant of money in order to hire experts to help them through this process. And so they did that last year and they received that grant. And so everything that we submit to the state, we also submit to the Office of Environmental Quality that is also reviewed by the city staff.
Thanks. So the groundwater samples, we installed 9 new wells. And then there were already a bunch of wells in this area where the petroleum contamination was known to be. So we sampled some of those as well. We analyzed for the same constituents generally. And as I mentioned, I think before, this area up here under the building, we're going to come back and do that later. We can't really easily drill through the building right now. So we'll do that later in coordination with deconstruction. On the next slide. Okay, so this is trying to summarize a lot of data that's in the report into a couple of bullets here. But what we see, and I'm going to go by class of contaminant, so starting with metals, what we see is that generally the concentrations of metals are below VDEQ screening levels for industrial use. So VDEQ has two sets of screening levels. One for industrial or commercial use, so concentrations that are okay for commercial and industrial use, and then a separate set of screening levels for residential use. So probably obvious, but I'm going to say it in case it's not, the screening levels for residential use are lower concentrations than the screening levels for industrial commercial use, primarily because people spend more time at their residence and also the presence of children. So certain chemicals have developmental effects, and so there are concerns about child exposure versus adult exposure. For the purpose of this conversation, I'm going to talk about the industrial screening levels because that is the currently relevant screening level for the current use of the property. The next step in the VRP process after this sampling is what's called a risk assessment, and that's a human health risk assessment. That risk assessment will consider both current and potential future use of the property. And because there is residential use planned here and other recreational and those types of uses, the risk assessment will consider all of those uses. I want that to be very clear. But just for the purpose of my talking about what we found, those are we are comparing to the industrial screening levels. So for metals, generally we're seeing concentrations below those industrial screening levels with a few exceptions: thallium, iron, and manganese, 3 metals. And what we see is not widespread impacts of those metals, but sort of localized areas. There's a couple of samples where we see higher concentrations. With the petroleum hydrocarbons, we see them up here where we knew there to be oil. And then there's one other location in the rail yard where we did see elevated petroleum hydrocarbon concentrations. PCBs were not, yep.
Sorry, just one quick note, just for the folks who are on the phone, when you're pointing, if you could just like describe what you're pointing
Thanks,
to.
Rodney.
Yep.
Yes. All right, I gotta go back. The things I pointed at where the petroleum hydrocarbons were detected, I'm pointing at the lime green area behind the building. And then there was one location in the rail yard. I like to point at things. PCBs, we have not yet detected PCBs in soil or groundwater samples collected from the site. I'm saying yet because if I were going to make a bet, I would find them in this red area, and we have not sampled there yet. So for now, we haven't seen them. We might still find some. And then the SVOCs and VOCs were below industrial screening levels. We didn't see anything too exciting with those classes. In the groundwater, similar. Yeah, go ahead.
Screening level and action.
That's a great question. Petroleum, because it's a group of chemicals. So petroleum hydrocarbons are not one chemical. There are lots of different chemicals, different hydrocarbon chains. There's not one concentration that's specific to like a specific chemical, if that makes sense. So VDEQ uses an action level, and it's sort of a total concentration of a group of chemicals. And that's why the language is different. So for petroleum hydrocarbons, it's an action level. For the other constituents, it's a screening level that is specific to that chemical. But yes, that is a very good notice. It is different. In the groundwater, we see similar things. Again, manganese, which is one of the metals we saw in the soil. We see manganese in the groundwater at some locations above screening levels. We don't see the thallium and the iron that we saw in the soil. Metals have different solubilities, and it just turns out that manganese is the one that we're seeing. Petroleum hydrocarbons, the only place where we saw the petroleum hydrocarbons in groundwater above an action level, not a screening level, good catch, is in this green area where we already knew there was petroleum contamination. So we haven't found meaningfully a lot of new petroleum contamination on this site, which is good. That is one of the types of chemicals that you will see. Again, this was largely a coal-fired plant, but you often see other fuels used in sort of auxiliary uses, and we're not seeing significant petroleum contamination outside of this green area, which we already did know about. PCBs, again, not detected. That's not terribly surprising. PCBs, even when present in soil, are not particularly soluble in water, so we don't commonly see them. And then SVOCs and VOCs, we didn't see anything above screening levels. Go ahead.
Know that groundwater has been infiltrated with the oil.
Mhm.
And that is an ongoing project. It leads from closest to the water and going up the trail almost to the power plant. And those properties, one is owned by Pepco further up. Then you've got the property owned by you all now. And then you have the property owned by the Park Service. And all of those are involved. So I'm trying to say,
These
this
three
is not an
properties?
easy thing.
It's not
It's
an easy
very
thing.
complex.
Yes, and I am going to talk about the petroleum impacted area after I get through these VRP slides, because you're right, this is a known contaminated area and it's been undergoing remediation for multiple years, and there will be a focused activity there. And I'll talk on a couple of slides about what has happened and what we plan to do going forward.
It's a 5-year project, hopefully.
This one
The one by the DEQ for the oil and the ground.
for the oil, it's already been more than 5 years. Yeah, it's been much longer than that already. Yep. And I do have slides on that next. I'll talk more about that. Okay, so the next steps under the VRP are, well, what we did after we did all the sampling was we submitted what's called a site characterization report to VDEQ. That's the report I was talking about before that documents all the sample results. You'll see it if you've seen it on our website. It's called a preliminary site characterization report. That's because we still got to come back and sample under here. And once we do that, we'll have completed our site characterization. So that's that additional sampling that will be conducted when those areas are more accessible. The next step in the VRP process and just in sort of environmental assessment and remediation in general is this human health risk assessment. And what the human health risk assessment allows us to do is, once we understand where the chemicals are and at what concentrations they're present, we then evaluate whether they pose a risk to human health. So we literally do calculations like, what if a little kid ate this dirt every day because they were playing outside? What risk would that pose to them? That's the next step. Once we do that, that tells us where remediation is necessary. So that's sort of the process that we go through, and we're still in the site characterization process, the collecting data part. But once we get through the human health risk assessment, that's when we figure out the remedial actions. At this site, given what I know already, I expect the remediation to include things like excavation and offsite disposal. We'll talk more about what's already been done in the petroleum area, but we're probably going to go in and dig some of that remaining mass out. I'll talk more about that on the next slide. That'll probably be a fundamental part of our remedial plan, is picking up some of this contaminated soil and removing it from the site so that it's no longer present. There's lots of other remedial technologies. Based on what we're seeing here so far, that's probably going to be our primary technology at this site. You can go to the next slide. Okay, here's the known petroleum area. So what this figure shows is, now we're zoomed in on what was that green shape earlier. And so you can see here these yellow boxes here, those are the underground storage tanks that were the source of this petroleum release. And those tanks are still in the ground. The oil has been removed from them. They've been closed in place, but they're still physically there. And then essentially what you have is petroleum impacts moving this way. This orange line is important. This is a sheet pile wall, and it's important because it impacts the flow of both water and oil in the ground. So if this wasn't here, there'd be a sort of a straighter shot for this material to move towards the river. With this here, it changes the flow direction. It has to move farther. So that actually was very lucky that that wall was there, because it really has limited the amount that this contamination was able to move. So this is an area that we knew about, that the prior owner knew about, and the prior owner implemented what's called an in situ remediation. And so what in situ means is that the remediation is done in place, essentially underground. And the reason they had to focus on an in situ remediation here, sometimes an in situ remediation is just the way to go. Sometimes it's the best technology. In this case, given the proximity of the power plant, you couldn't dig this up. The power plant would have fallen on your head if you tried to dig a big hole there. It just logistically was not feasible. And that's what will change. When he takes the power plant down, we can get in here. He's excited about it. We can get in here and remove some of this residual mass. I want to be clear, a lot of this mass has been remediated. A lot of the contamination has been cleaned up, but not all of it. It's hard to get at all of it when you're sort of working a little blind. So our intent is to come in and remove some of this residual mass when it's possible. So when you don't have the risk of a power plant falling on your head anymore. In the meantime, we monitor this area very closely. So we quarterly are coming out here. We're monitoring the presence of this petroleum contamination through groundwater samples, measuring water levels. And so we watch it very closely to make sure that it's stable, that this contamination isn't moving anywhere it shouldn't. And then in coordination with the deconstruction, we'll come in and take some more of this out so that the concentrations come down lower. You were asking a question about this before. I don't know if I answered your question. You're good. Okay. So this is, you don't need to really worry about, but this is also overseen by VDEQ, but it's a separate regulatory program because this is not voluntary. This is like oil got out of a tank, you have to go clean it up. There's nothing voluntary about that. The other stuff that we were talking about is we are on purpose going to look and find contamination that may not be here. This is known and must be cleaned up. There's no voluntary nature to it. Yep.
Has any sampling been done of the barrels in the basement of the plant, the barrels of oil?
So in the basement of the plant, so I just want to be clear on the location here. So I'm pointing to the image where the tanks are currently drawn. So if you were looking at the plant, there's again that large kind of structural steel shaped structure. Here the stacks, this is Riverside. This is outside the basement of the plant where these two tanks are in the soil underneath the current pavement. Inside the plant, kind of where the stacks are and going towards the switch yard or the electrical equipment, that's in the basement. So like I noted earlier, we have teams going through and identifying the regulated materials, including a tank list to identify if there's any residuals left. The majority of this power plant from an equipment perspective has already been cleaned. Motors drained, tanks emptied, the silos have been emptied except for just residuals, which we'll go through and finish the cleaning of. So that's a long way of saying that we're not aware of any tanks inside of the power plant that have oil in them at this time.
Yeah, just to follow on what Nick says, generally when you buy a property like this, oil, if it's like of any sort of meaningful quantity, will be removed because there's value to it. When it's got in the ground, they don't want to worry about it. That's where I come in. But if there's residual product left that can be sold, that would typically be sold prior to our acquisition because there's value in it. And I think that might be my last slide. I talked for a long time. Who's next? You're next.
Simon's going to be on the.
Oh, he's on the hybrid.
Hey, good evening. Thanks, Juliana. Appreciate that. And my name's Simon Beer. I'm a principal with OJB Landscape Architecture, and I'm thrilled to be here speaking with you this evening regarding the open space framework for the redevelopment of the Potomac River Generating Station. We have really enjoyed the engagement that our team has had throughout the past meetings during the CDD process, where we analyzed and discussed the potentials for the open space. The culmination of this framework provides a wonderful myriad of distinct open space typologies that include the waterfront open space, the rail corridor open space, the waterfront plaza, and the linear open space along the Pepco substation. In addition, the streetscapes around the blocks will offer generous sidewalks and green infrastructure scaled for human comfort. The project provides 14 acres of new and improved existing open space, which includes 5.5 acres of the PRGS property and over 8 acres on the adjacent National Park Service and Norfolk Southern lands. On the next slide, during the CDD process, we were able to gain incredibly helpful insight from you and the community regarding the organization of some of these open spaces, along with the types of programming and activation that was most desirable to you. Well, we had over 215 respondents to the online poll. In addition to participation during the past community meetings, we look forward to gaining further input and feedback from you and the community on developing this open space further. And we wanted to share tonight a little bit about that timeframe and the process. So subsequent to the submission of Concept 1 plan for the waterfront open space and the rail corridor open space, HRP and our design team will present conceptual plans for these areas and solicit further feedback from you and the community on its organization, the activation, and the programming. Now, this community engagement will include digital surveying along with some in-person outreach, and that will occur this spring. Now, our team is going to process, evaluate, and share all of this feedback and input during the next community meeting that will occur in the summer or fall. This feedback will help us inform further development of the open space design as we continue to iterate, and we'll present these updates and further detail regarding the concepts during that time. The development may include some alternatives for the community's input and consideration, and will again involve virtual and in-person opportunities to share your feedback. Lastly, the culmination of all of this community-driven process, will be a public presentation for the waterfront and rail corridor open spaces to the city committees and city council in early 2024, where we will provide an overview of all of the community engagement process, a summary of the feedback, and the implementation of that feedback in the final design plans. And with that, I'm going to pass off the presentation to Linda with Arup for a look at the coordinated sustainability strategy overview.
Okay, thank you, Simon. So again, the Coordinated Sustainability Strategy, or CSS, that we talk in acronyms a lot on this project, is the guiding document for all things sustainability at both the site master plan as well as the phased block development for the entire project over the long duration of the plan. So on the next slide, giving a little overview of it. So the CSS gets into first the roadmap for how we're meeting specific targets related to sustainability from CDD conditions that Melissa was mentioning in the first process of the project, as well as specific categories that we talk about, topical strategies, again, at both site application as well as building block level. And then also what the ongoing reporting is that happens for once people start occupying the site and using the buildings and the spaces throughout. And then we can learn lessons learned from phase 1, implement what has changed and what goes well in the future phases of the project. So we'll get into each of these 5 categories and talk a little bit more about some specifics of what is within the categories. So first, starting at the macro scale, for the site, the 3 major topics that we bucket our strategies into are open space. So largely what Simon was talking about, and we'll be gathering more feedback, but also layering in things like biodiversity and connecting ecosystems, right? We're adjacent to the waterfront, we're adjacent to a corridor for open space that has natural areas. Green infrastructure, also including stormwater solutions, right? Adding more density to the site and making sure that we're responsibly managing all of that. And then, of course, circulation and transportation, how people are not only getting to the site, but moving within the site as well between different parcels of the project. On the second topic, energy and carbon, a lot of our CDD sustainability targets are related to energy and carbon. So a lot of detail in our roadmaps about achieving things like on-site renewables, operational performance targets, and then really just ensuring that we're using the best-in-class solutions that make sense at each phase of the project for this. So all electric building systems for HVAC systems and hot water, really efficient appliances and equipments that are available for the project, but also working closely with all of the design partners, right, of passive strategies, how we design the building and the orientation of the building to make it the most energy efficient possible. And then as we're moving towards occupancy, of course, thinking about things like commissioning, ensuring that our great construction teams are properly installing everything, everything's connected the right way, and that we have some transparency to make sure it will operate as it is designed to. In the water category, simply breaking this down into what the buildings do inside with water and what we do outside of the buildings on the site with water. So aggressively targeting and aligning with Alexandria has some really good, strong commitments to water use to just reduce the loads on municipal systems. So reduction from efficient fixtures inside the building and looking at responsible use of water outside the building, things like native plants that require less irrigation, right kind of irrigation fixtures like drip irrigation versus those spray faucets that spray everywhere and spray things they're not supposed to spray. So making sure that we're responsibly using all the water and containing as much of it on site as we can for reuse. Human health. So this is everything from indoor environmental quality of the buildings to well-being in outdoor and indoor spaces, as well as how things in the built environment impact humans. So occupant comfort in the buildings, having access to control your own thermostat, making sure you're comfortable in your space, thinking about access to daylight in the buildings, what kind of materials we're using to reduce off-gassing, and also really focusing in on responsible material procurement. The industry has really done a good job of moving of what the transparency and of producing the materials is, from extraction of raw materials through manufacturing and getting it to the site, as well as what happens and what's available to happen to a product at end of life. So really thinking about a circular economy for materials in buildings, and also then waste management, both for construction as well during operations, connecting the site into the existing Alexandria composting program. Again, thinking not just design, but all the way through operations of the site. And then our last category, thinking about climate and resilience. Alexandria has different committees that have been looking at what the climate science is telling us. To summarize that in very dumbed down terms, it's going to get wetter and it's going to get hotter. What that means is we want to plan for that long-term for our buildings. So generally planning for more extreme weather, so more heavier rainfall events typically, and then also making sure that we have infrastructure hardening, right? So there's flexibility of acknowledging that the climate might be different from what we're currently seeing or what we've been seeing for the past 10 years, in 10 years or 15 years from now. So thinking about our systems and our buildings to be able to prepare for that or adjust if needed during operations. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Mary Catherine to take any questions and talk about schedule.
Awesome. All right, thank you very much. So we have talked about these three topics. We're going to have more meetings to talk about additional topics. We like to do deep dives so you can get a sufficient amount of information at each one of our meetings. So we wanted to give enough time for these really important topics. So I guess I didn't point the last time I was doing this. So we are right here, right now, this blue circle. And so, as I said previously, we're going to continue to have community meetings. We don't have dates for them yet, but we're going to have more later this spring and over the summer and in the fall. And we'll give ample opportunity for notice of those meetings. So whoever wants to attend can continue to attend. The CSS that Linda just described is going to have a work session in front of the Planning Commission and the City Council in March. So March 7th and March 14th. I don't know if we've gotten final confirmation on March 14th, but we're pretty close. We'll be with City Council. And then we'll go to them for their approval after they've had a work session on it the following month. And then we'll go for the IDSP, the Infrastructure Development Site Plan, is going in front of the Planning Commission in June of this year. We'll then move forward with the block DSUPs, and as part of this whole process, you'll hear more about that development as we get further along in the year. We'll have several meetings on that block development, and we're looking to have a planning commission hearing on those blocks in late of the fourth quarter of this year. We have other meetings that will come up that we'll let you guys know about. There is a urban design advisory committee that looks at plans in Old Town North. We will have to go to them. We are having actually a meeting with them this Wednesday to look at the IDSP and to show them the the design standards that we have to comply with as we move forward. So that is where we are currently. And then we want to be able to answer as many questions as we can. I think it was really good, the interactive nature of the questions before. And I think we do have one online that was asked that I would like us to sort of get to, and then we'll continue on with those questions if that's okay. Michelle, do you want to read that question?
Sure.
He does.
He does. That's after me. This question is from Bruce Wiley. When will the bid packages be released to select a demolition contractor? And did I hear Nick say that proposals with means and methods will be presented in a community meeting before selection?
So exact timing, well, good question, and exact timing on the deconstruction and abatement bid package is still TBD. Like I said, we're in the fact finding kind of frame of our process right now. I would say later this year is going to be the earliest, second half of this year be the earliest we get to a contractor selection, and we'll be updating everyone as we continue to make progress on that. What was the other part of that question, Michelle? Oh, means and methods. Once the demolition or the decon contractor is selected, our typical process to have them present how they're going to execute on the deconstruction and abatement of this project. So that's what I meant by means and methods will be presented to the community is when that demolition or deconstruction contractor is on the team working with all our consultants, and we can present our entire plan and path forward here.
I have a follow-up question related from Eric Lawrence. Best guess on when construction will actually begin, which I think you answered to a certain degree, and which block goes first?
So I may just answer that from an overall project perspective, right? Because these are all tied together. You've seen we have all of these subject experts, but they have to work on the site that we're currently designing and permitting, right? We're taking it through the entitlement process. And so we have to all interweave our various processes together. We think it's probably going to take us until the middle or third quarter of 2024 to complete the entitlement process on the first phase. I think there was a sub question in there, which is which block is first. What we've submitted in our first phase of DSUPs, there are 3 actually, are blocks A, B, and C. So those southernmost 3 blocks. That's our intent, is to permit those initially and start from the south and work our way towards the north. So we think it's probably going to take us, by the time we're finished with the initial discretionary permitting process, which is when we go to Planning Commission and City Council for votes. But after that, there is still work to be done as we finalize those design plans and review them with staff, and then actually pull building permits. So it's quite a bit of time. And the deconstruction process will be timed to overlap with that somewhat so that we can overall shorten the duration of the work of the activity on site. So I would say it's likely you'll start to see some preparatory work later this year, but the vast majority of it will not really start until 2024.
I should have said this earlier. We have members of the city's planning and zoning department here with us who have been reviewing this project regularly. Catherine Miliaris and Michael Swidwack they have been reviewing this project for a long time, and just really glad that you guys could be here and continue to look forward to working with you through this process. Mr. Mento, did you have another question?
I am asking a question about how you will detonate the building. And my concern is that the power plant is in an area where other buildings exist. And the concern is, how will you keep ash and so forth off of the surrounding buildings when you do demolish the plant?
So just to clarify, and I thought I opened with this earlier, we will not be using explosives or implosions to bring the structure down. So there will be no detonations. That is not what we intend to do on this project. We will go in with either a crane. I don't know if we can flip back to the photos all the way at the beginning. But it's almost selective demolition in an essence. Right here, perfect. So this structure in this photo here, so I'm pointing to the photo on the right. This was actually a much taller structure. It was about 300 feet tall. You can see the last 150 feet. So what we did on this structure is we used that big crane and a sizable labor force to take this apart in pieces. And that's what we intend to do on this project, is to bring the power plant and all the auxiliary structures down in pieces, whether it's with another large crane, like you can see in this photo, or with large excavators, which we also call high reaches.
Okay, you're talking about, I guess, hauling off the property, all these structures you take apart, correct?
Correct. Yes, we'll remove
Now,
them.
how will you haul these very large pieces
Mhm.
through the small Alexandria streets?
That is another good question. So as we bring the structure down in pieces, which look sizable here, but they will all be downsized or cut up into pieces that will fit in the back of a typical semi truck or 18-wheeler, and then removed through agreed upon truck routes to the facilities that will recycle the steel or aggregate or other materials that we're removing during the deconstruction
Will
process.
you be given a traffic route by the city in which you have to travel?
Correct. I'll
the
turn it over to the.
deconstructed-
We'll have to develop what's called a CMP, or a construction management plan. Part of that plan will be what routes we have available into the site and what routes we have available to leave the site. Other components of that plan will be some of the things that we talked about earlier on the mitigation side. What's your rodent control plan? How are you going to monitor for dust? How are you going to monitor for noise? How are you going to monitor for vibration? Those things will all be in the construction management plan that will be developed in conjunction with the contractor that we engage to do the demolition work.
Have you informed the other stakeholders in this project to come to these meetings so they can be aware of what we're hearing?
We have an e-blast list of over 1,000 recipients that goes out. We post all of these meeting notices on our website. We've distributed flyers with meeting notices in local businesses. So, and the city posts it on their website as well. And I believe you blasted out to the list of interested parties that they've been tracking, people that have written to them. So it goes out pretty broadly.
I would just add, the construction management plan that Melissa was just describing, that will be part of the community outreach meetings that are taking place, so that community will be engaged as part of that process. Once we know what that plan is, we will hold a meeting so the community knows what all of these plans are, is when they're developed. They're not developed yet. Yes, sir.
What is the process for giving this project a name? And the area when it's finished? Torpedo North or what?
Do you have any suggestions?
Well, we thought about it today, but we didn't get any good ones.
Well, we're open to your suggestions. We haven't named it yet. It won't be the Potomac River Generating Station site. I can guarantee you. It will be something much catchier than that, but we have not begun the naming and
But
branding process yet.
What's the process for naming it? Does the city name it?
No, we'll name it. We'll name it. I can describe it. I've done it on many projects. You typically hire a consultant for it, and you run through the vision of the site and all of the history and all of the different kinds of factors that would play into a new name for the site. And it's a very lengthy process. Lots of, people will participate in that in-house, and we'll probably do some outside research as well. Then when you find something, you have to make sure that nobody else already has it. So you have to do an extensive legal copyright analysis. And then come up with the brand, right? The name is one thing, but then you actually come up with the brand. What does it look like, and how do you communicate that brand across different kind of media? So whether it's online or in print or social media, those kinds of things.
It'd be interesting for you because you're in a city where we can rename 50% of our streets.
Yes, and there will also be a street naming process for the new roads. I mean, Fairfax Street is coming into our site, Royal Street is coming into our site, but there are some new roadways that we're creating with the new street grid. And so there will be roads to be named there as well. And that is a process that we do with the city. Marketing opportunities for the street names? Could be, could be. I don't know. You know, I think, I think it would be nice to name the streets in a way that's cohesive with the naming of the development. But we'll see. There's lots of factors at play.
Let's take a question from online.
Sure.
Maria LaCruz asks, I know the buildings will be between 160 feet and 172 feet, but approximately how many floors high is that?
That's a great question. So it depends on if you're talking about a commercial building, so an office building or a residential building or a combination. We anticipate that pretty much all of the ground floors of every single block will have an active component, not only lobbies into, you know, condominium buildings and rental buildings, but also ground floor retail. So those floors, the lower level, the ground level are typically higher. They're typically around 18 or 20 feet high. And then it depends on whether you're building commercial space above or residential space above. Commercial space typically has a higher, what we call floor to floor height. So the distance between one floor surface to the next floor surface, that's typically higher in commercial buildings. So you get less floors. And then in residential buildings, that's a little lower. So you get a few more floors. So in those height ranges, it'll likely be somewhere between 12 and 16 stories, depending on the use.
I think I heard that the stacks are going to be removed brick by brick. Is that true?
Well, I'll say something that I know about the stacks and then I'll hand it over to Nick. So I think one thing that's important to know is that the stacks don't come all the way to the ground. The brick actually stops lower than, there's a steel structure below, obviously they're not floating in air, but the brick itself doesn't come all the way to ground.
So it's a great question. Again, in partnership with our deconstruction team or the contract that we bring on board, we'll finalize the plan. Similar type stacks that we have on other projects. We can do it either in literally a piece by piece with workers and scaffolding up there, removing it by hand. There's other companies we can hire that'll put a machine up there that'll bring it down on itself, and we'll use like a machine that sits on top. And there's a couple other options that would involve a crane and another suspended machine, but generally your question is right. It'll be piece by piece. It's just a matter of actual workers up there or a piece of equipment that is to be determined. As you can see from some of the photos we're just looking at, it's very tight quarters up there. And there's a lot of analysis we need to do with the structural engineers and whatnot to select that best method for safety. And then also, you know, the community taking, you know, our neighbors into account so we don't disturb y'all as well.
Is that to avoid what happened in Chicago a few years ago when you demolished a plant in the city and you detonated it and all the air and fly ash went over to the next town where in the state the highest level of coronavirus existed?
Yeah,
And
so
that's
this is
a big health issue.
It's a valid question. This is completely different project and a completely different type of structure when we're speaking about the stacks. So this is a piece by piece using either equipment or manpower up there to do that is the best path forward.
And I'll just,
But I think same principle of safety have to be regarded.
absolutely. And on this and all of our projects, safety of the workers on site and also our neighbors is the utmost important thing for us. One thing I will just point out, like what we're saying is this is not going to be an implosive process. This is going to be a mechanical dismantling. Some of it may be handwork. Some of it's going to involve equipment. It's a big facility. So it will be done in the safest and most efficient way possible. And now I forgot what I was going to say. It just ran out of my head. I'll have to come back to it. Oh, that's what I was going to say. Thank you. Thank you. One thing to understand, if I go back to Nick's earlier slide, is that the regulated materials, including asbestos, are removed prior to the dismantlement process. So it's not a case where, you're pulling something off and it's got asbestos all over it. There's a very highly regulated abatement process, especially for asbestos, that involves containment areas under negative pressure, meaning the negative pressure is negative air pressure. So it's sucking air in to the containment facility within which the workers are working. And they go section by section by section. They don't do the whole plant at once because they have to work in a controlled fashion and they can only control so much territory at once. So they're doing all of that work before we even get to this stage, before we even start to dismantle.
I'm concerned about the fly ash in the stacks because the nature of fly ash is very fluffy and it quickly goes with the wind. And that's the leftover fly ash is what I'm concerned about.
So again, very, very good question on the fly ash. If you go to the mitigation, water mitigate or dust mitigation slide. So as you can see in these photos, again, ample amount of water is being used. So to Melissa's point, fly ash regulated materials, including asbestos and others, will be removed prior to the deconstruction. I just want to continue to emphasize that. And then it's really the nuisance dust that we're mitigating with the water. So if we were to do this in a hand method, right? So team members are up there, they'll have point of source or localized water as they're doing that work to mitigate the dust that may kick up even after all the fly ash has been removed. And then if we were to do it with, an excavator, like in that photo, again, we'd have water at the point of work. That'd be wetting that area down to mitigate that dust from kicking up and leaving the site. A couple other areas, not to get too far into it, but like I talked about the precipitators earlier, a lot of that structure, including like the inside of the building where we're doing the abatement, that all gets washed down before deconstruction. That's typically the last process outside of the clearances. We wash everything down to remove as much dust and other material that's left prior to us going in there to do the deconstruction. So that's just typical process of what we do.
I would just add that typically the energy companies that operated these facilities during, their operational lifetime, when they shut them down and when they abandon them, they have typically gone through and cleaned them out pretty thoroughly because they don't want to have an environmental issue on their hands, right? So if there's petroleum product that's left over that has value, they're going to go after that. They're going to remove it, but they also typically go through their facilities and they do try to clean them out. They don't just, shut the door and walk away because they certainly don't want those environmental issues coming back.
Do you have a record that the last owner of the power plant did in fact clean?
We have reports.
So there are reports. The previous owner had completed reports up to the decommissioning of the power plant. And then, like I said earlier, we're in the process of confirming some of the information, if not all of it in those reports, and then adding to it. So I talked about the motors earlier, some of them are already tagged that they've been cleaned and removed of oils inside those motors. So again, as part of our process right now, the information, the fact finding process, we're going through identifying the motors, the transformers, to Juliana's point, the tanks, where the asbestos is, identifying that to the best of our ability, handing that over to the professionals, the ones who are best in class in completing this work. So they can put a plan together that is executable, presenting that to the city, to the other regulators so they can review it and make sure that they're in alignment with that. And then we can go and execute on it. But again, regulated materials will be removed prior to the deconstruction as to what we know and can find.
Let's take a question from the web online folks. Martha Harris asks, where on site will the trucks and equipment be located? And when will the human risk assessment be done?
So that's a two-part question. I will take the first piece. So like Melissa and Mary Catherine said earlier, the logistics plan, the CMP plan are still being developed. Those will be presented and approved prior to us starting that work. And then on the
risk assessment, sure. The human health risk assessment is the next phase in the voluntary remediation program after the completion of the site characterization work. So the site characterization work, a lot of it is complete, except for under the I can't point to anything here. Under the building, you all saw it, under the building and the red, yeah, except for in here. So once we have physical access to this area to do the sampling, we'll have a larger data set, and then the human health risk assessment will be conducted on that complete data set.
So her comment on the smokestacks made me think of, there are a couple buildings in DC where they basically kept the smokestack and integrated into their new design. Is there anything on the site, smokestacks, or anything that you might kind of keep as a historical salute?
There will be. It won't be the smokestacks because of the issue that I mentioned earlier, that they actually don't go all, the masonry structure component of them doesn't go all the way to grade. But we are working with Simon Beer, who you met virtually from OJB, our landscape architect, as well as the architects of the buildings, to think about different components around the site that we could use in the landscape, that we might be able to use in a retail space or something like that. We did remove it from this rail yard. Last year, we did remove, I don't even remember how many linear feet of track, but all the track that used to be within our site has been removed, and we preserved 1,500 linear feet of, or some very large amount, so that we could use that as a landscape device in the future, maybe a sculpture, maybe, you know, a trace of what used to be there in the past as part of our design. That looks like that's the end of the online questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions?
Well, we,
We really appreciate you guys coming out.
thanks everyone who came out in person, and thanks to everyone who joined us online. As Mary Catherine mentioned, we'll be putting a recording of this meeting up on our website, which is hrpalx.com, as well as putting the presentation, this document that you're seeing here, on the site, and then give us a couple of weeks, but we will write down all of the questions that we heard tonight and also answer them in writing and post that on our website as well.
One last comment for the folks who are in the room. If you have not signed in at the table in the front, please do so. We want to keep good record of who is out showing up to the events, and really appreciate you guys for doing so. Thank you.